As you round the corner of the dungeon corridor, peering across the rubble, you see a bunch of beady yellow eyes in the darkness, just glaring back at you. Beyond them, you hear a faint humming, like a song reverberating across the chamber. You raise your torch, hoping to catch a glimpse of the unknown, seeing the light flicker in the yellow eyes, and wham! The goblins charge out of the darkness. Roll for initiative. If you're anything like me, you play your games in person, and you draw your dungeons on wet erase maps. Maybe your living room table has a wet erasable surface and 5-foot combat squares pasted on the tabletop thanks to your dad's signage printing company. Yes, this is a purely theoretical example. If you're even more like me, then you've always struggled with drawing interesting battle maps. Luckily for both of us, Chris Perkins published some really good advice on this back in 2012. Back before 5th edition even existed. Let's see what he had to say. Welcome to Mystic Arts, where we've resigned ourselves to having ink-covered hands after using the wet erase map. My name is Daði, I'm a professional writer and director, and I've been DMing for 10 years. In this episode, we're hopping into the art corner to talk about Battlemaps. Now, Chris Perkins' article, link in the description, was about what he called map foo. In it, he outlined 7 tricks he uses when drawing both appealing and functional battle maps. But I think his advice comes with basically 2 assumptions. Number 1, keep your intentions for your map obvious. Your players should know what every part of the map is supposed to represent. They should know how those parts function and how they differ from the rest of your scribbles. Number 2, your map should be more than an empty rectangle. Being a DM does not mean you need to be a master artist, but part of being a DM is filling your worlds with details that make it believable. That same responsibility extends, I think, to the creation of your battle maps. Adding details when drawing has the added benefit of adding details to your world. You don't have to go overboard with this, just a little goes a long way. To illustrate this as best we can, I've drawn up a small battle map. This is a large open chamber that could be the temple of a forgotten god. In here we'll fight the bad guy of our adventure and his goblin minions. This is a perfectly functional battle map. There's nothing wrong with it. But it could be better. Before we dive into the nitty-gritty map food details, let's take a moment to remember what's most important when it comes to designing a battle map. You're drawing a game board. Yes, this map represents a place in your campaign world, it has a purpose, a history, and it serves some kind of function, but that's all secondary to the most important element: fun. You're playing a game. So before we do anything else, we're going to add various game elements to the map. Little bits of interest that'll create opportunities for gameplay. Number 1, elevation. Let's create platforms that stand above the rest, something that's going to dictate cover, line of sight, and even movement. We'll incorporate these elevations as part of the dais used in the temple to show deference to the god and her worshippers. We'll mark these elevations with little indicators explaining how they work. I like to write the height on the map, 10 feet. We'll also add stairs to indicate where the players can move up or down without issue. Otherwise they'll have to jump, climb, or even fly. Cover. D&D has tons of ranged combat options, but bows, spells, thrown weapons, and area of effect magic typically don't go around corners. You want to create ways for your players to get into cover. In an area as big as our temple, it's best if that cover is fairly wide, so that enemies can't just bypass it entirely by moving laterally. These 10-foot wide pillars should be columns built to hold the vaulted ceiling aloft. Difficult terrain. On larger battle maps, designating an area as difficult terrain will also help shape the battlefield in interesting ways. Difficult terrain gives players an opportunity to control the shape of the battle, or cast their own crowd control spells to further constrain the battle map. It also gives players who can climb, jump, or fly an opportunity to use those abilities to greater advantage. Flying in particular is a way to completely avoid most forms of difficult terrain. In our running example, these will be the pews of the temple. Low furniture can make excellent difficult terrain. Use the grid. Since our battle map has a grid, let's use it. Always fill squares completely. It should be obvious to players whether a square is open, difficult terrain, or counts as cover. Avoid questions like, can I stand here, or is this cover, by making it obvious on the battle map itself. That's what maps are for. Sometimes I might fill a square halfway with some object, terrain, or cover, and consider it difficult terrain to move through, and while I think that's a fine compromise, I suggest avoiding it as much as you can. Rubble, Perkins says, is the easiest kind of terrain to draw and implement. It's tactically interesting, both as difficult terrain or as cover. And it can always be easily explained, and it only takes a moment to draw. Rubble comes in two sizes, rough circle shapes to represent big chunks, and small stippling dots for loose terrain. Cliffs have forks. When drawing cliffs, you should fill up entire squares since they're gameplay elements. Then you draw lines, which typically look best when they aren't straight, and every few cliff lines we add a little fork. It tends to give cliffs this naturally chiseled look. If you want your cliffs to look less steep, you can make them take up even more space, giving them a slower incline. And the inverse is also true. Minimal furnishing, Perkins says, might be ideal. It lets you fill more of the map with monsters. Often all you need is a single indicator. A bed in the middle of a room shows that it's a bedroom, or at least that someone sleeps there. You also want to highlight the gameplay elements. If there are objects in the room that you want the players to interact with, draw them. Video games aren't afraid of highlighting interactable objects. You can do the same in your role-playing game. It won't break immersion. Draw that obelisk. You should also draw the doors and any staircases to indicate where players can choose to go from here. For furnishings, avoid empty rectangles. Put handles on chairs, wood grain on tables, little details here and there to indicate what's what. Another little trick is that drawing railings as hollow walls tend to help the players figure out what it is. If you want to draw battlements and crenellations, you can start with the corner blocks first. Then draw a block over each grid line so that it straddles the two squares. Add a block in between each of the ones you've already drawn, and then connect the blocks with a thinner double line to complete the battlement. And finally, fill in your dead space with cross-hatching. It quickly illustrates which part of the map are thick walls, providing total cover, and which parts are rooms. You can make this really nice. I love looking at them, but I tend to squiggle them pretty quickly just to get the job done and move on. You don't need to go overboard. Some is always better than none. You can spend loads of time on this stuff. Since my table is literally my battle map, I tend to draw everything live in front of the players, so I scribble a lot. Maybe that's just my style. Imperfect. Other times, I draw the dungeons on separate wet erase maps before the game starts, roll it up, and then bust it out when the players actually get to the encounter. But then, no battle map needs to be perfect. I tend to find that 80% of progress happens in the first 20% of the allotted time. And then that final 20% of progress from fine to finished ends up taking 80% of your time. That can be discouraging, but think of it this way. If you put in that 20% of your time, you're practically at the end already, and your players will love it. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Map foo, like everything else in your DM toolbox, is just a tool. It's not the end-all be-all of all solutions. Just play around with it. And that's where we're going to pick it up next time. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this video useful, let me know in the comments or by hitting the like button. And if you want to see more like it, try subscribing. Until next time, keep studying the mystic arts.